Hi, today I'm going to recommend some books about Roman paganism. There are quite a few books we have, both primary and secondary sources. The primary sources are more extensive than for a lot of other forms of paganism. We don't have as much as we'd like. We know from quotations in what we do have that there were many books on religion that are now lost because the Christian scholars and the Muslim scholars who were copying the texts and who preserved them for us weren't interested in preserving books on Roman paganism. But what we do have is still quite informative, and we know a lot about Roman religion as a result. Okay, first I'm going to start with some introductions, and the names and the authors of these books will be in the description. You'll probably want to read these two books before you start on any of the other ones. It'll give you just a fairly basic background. The first one I want to recommend is An Introduction to Roman Religion by John Scheid. It's one of those densely packed books where you almost want to underline what you aren't interested in. He goes through a lot of information on the ritual before even tackling the gods, which is really quite a good idea because Roman religion was more about ritual than it was about the gods. And after all, much of what they did for the gods they adopted from the Greeks anyways. It includes information on the calendar, on sacrifice, on prayers, on divination. Excellent book. I found it well written, and it's just jam-packed with information. The other good introductory book is The Romans and Their Gods in the Age of Augustus by Ogilvie. When Augustus took over, as part of his state building program, he wanted to revive the ancient cults as much as possible. And I say as much as possible because a lot actually had been forgotten even in those days. But it's still a very important period in history of Roman paganism because it's the hinge between the Republican era and the Imperial era. So a lot of old things are being recovered, a lot of old things are continuing, but then a lot of new things are starting to come into Rome. It has a pretty good description of a sacrifice in here, typical Roman sacrifice, as much as you can say one of those actually existed. Once you have a basic background in the secondary sources, it's always good to try to tackle the primary sources. A lot of what we know about Roman religion is just scattered through the various sources, you know, a line here or a line there. But there are a few that are fairly densely packed, so it'll prevent you from having to read a lot of text for only a small amount of information. The first I want to talk about is Ovid Fasti. This is a treatment of the first half of the ritual year. Unfortunately, he never finished it. Most of what we know about the Roman year actually does come from this book, so we know a lot more about the first half of the Roman year than we know about the second half. He goes through the year day by day, describing what happened on that day, what gods were worshipped, what kind of rituals were used, and things like that. The Roman calendar was pretty densely packed with ceremonies, with festivals, so there's an awful lot of information in here as a result. And of course, he also tells myths to explain why things are done the way they are, so you're going to pick up on that. Describes various gods and goddesses you might not know much information about from other sources, and so on. It's in the form of a poem, so we can get a little flowery at times. This is the Low Classical Library edition. I really like using them because on one side there's the Latin, and the other side there's the English. Even if you don't know Latin, sometimes it's nice to just compare a little bit. If you find a line that seems really important, before you base any big argument on it, you're going to want to make sure it was translated fairly accurately. So even if you just pull out a Latin dictionary, you might be able to learn something, or you can find someone who can translate Latin for you. So I'm a big fan of the Low Classical Library editions. Second primary source I want to talk about is Macrobius Saturnalia. The idea that he has in here is that a number of scholars, antiquarians, are getting together at Saturnalia for a few days of just talking, mostly about poetry. There's a large section here analyzing the Aeneid, which isn't particularly interesting for someone who's mostly interested in finding out about paganism. But there's also an awful lot of information. It's pretty well packed, and he's one of the sources that has a lot of quotations from texts that we've now lost. So that information is going to be very archaic. It's an easy read, I found. I ended up skimming a lot of the information that's just on the Aeneid because it wasn't of interest to me. But the rest of it is very, very useful. And a fairly good read. Now, it's not on the cover. The Roman Questions of Plutarch. This is a collection of, well, questions like, why is the temple of Matuta forbidden to slave women, and why do the women bring in one slave girl only whom they slap and strike in the face? So he talks about various customs, many of them religious, of many things about ritual, and then gives his possible answers. Most of the possible answers are wrong and are based on fake etymologies, but still a lot of information does pop up in them. And of course, the fact that the questions are asked tells you that these sorts of things existed. This particular edition of it only has 50 pages of the questions. That's how many there are, but only 50 pages of it are the questions. So you might just want to find it in a library and read through the questions. But this particular edition also has a lot of notes, and I'm guessing most editions do, so it might be worth checking for the notes. You can probably learn a lot from them. This is book 4 of Servius's commentary on the Aeneid. Servius is a very important book. He talks an awful lot about religion. Unfortunately, he hasn't been translated, and it's even hard to find in the Latin. This one only translates one of the books. It's the only English translation I found of any of it. There are 12 books, just like in the Aeneid. So I'm very happy to find it, but unfortunately it is only the one book. But even in just one book, there's an awful lot of information. So those are the 4 major primary sources that you might want to start your investigation of primary sources with. Now let's return to secondary sources. First one I want to talk about is Scullard, Festivals and Ceremonies of the Roman Republic. This is an absolute classic. It's difficult to find. I was lucky enough to find it in a used bookstore and snapped it right up. The most well-referenced section of it is about the calendar, and he sort of like Ovid, he goes through the days of the calendar and what was done on them. Of course, he uses Ovid a lot, but for the second half of the year, obviously, he has to use other sources, and even for the first half, he's using other sources. But there's also a large amount of information here on other rituals through the year. A fairly in-depth discussion of sacrifice. I don't know if you can see this on here, but if you can, there's an awful lot of underlining and notes in the margin, which is always a good sign for me that a book has been very useful. This is a 2-volume work by Georges Dumézil. It's called Archaic Roman Religion. It's a little bit controversial, as pretty much everything by Dumézil was. He was a comparative Indo-Europeanist, so he tended to present topics in each of the Indo-European traditions in an Indo-European context. This causes problems for a number of people. Classicists don't like non-classicists sticking their nose in their field, and sometimes his trying to fit Roman religion to Indo-European religion is kind of like a Procrustean bed, and that can be a problem. Sometimes he kind of mushes things around to get it to fit right, but still his theories are definitely worth looking at, and if nothing else, he's got an awful lot of just information. Even if you don't trust his interpretation of the information is there. So another recommended book. It's a fairly easy read, I found. A nice recent book edited by Clifford Ando called Roman Religion. Let's see when it's from. It's 2003, so it's fairly recent. It's a collection of papers, some of them articles from books, on various aspects of Roman religion. This has got a few. There's sections on theology, which is what you frequently don't get. People seem to think that Romans didn't really have any theology, but of course they did, even if it was mostly implicit in their rituals rather than flat out stated. But those books that they wrote that we don't have any copies of frequently were on theology. Section on religious toleration. There's a fair amount of information on ritual in here. One good thing about this book is that everything that is quoted is translated. Sometimes the people who wrote the actual articles or chapters of the books in here didn't translate it themselves, but in those cases, Ando has translated them for us. So that's really quite nice. It gives us access to a lot of information that we otherwise would have difficulties finding. Those are the major ones specifically on Roman religion that I'm recommending as an introduction. There are two more here that are more for the hardcore people because they're on the bronze tablets of Iguvine. Those are some bronze tablets that have on them essentially a ritual manual for the town of Iguvine, which is an Umbrian town, and the Umbrians were closely related to the Romans, and the language of Umbrian is closely related to Latin. So what we read in these books is fairly similar to what the Romans would have done, but it's presented in pretty good detail. Problems with this, the biggest problem is that we don't know Umbrian as well as we know Latin, and we don't know Umbrian as well as we'd like, so translation can sometimes be a little iffy. A lot of the actual translation has to be checked against what the Romans did, so there's a certain circularity there. We know about the Romans because of what the Umbrians said, and we know about what the Umbrian means because we know about the Romans, but there's still an awful lot of information there. This particular book is the Bronze Tables of Iguvine by James Wilson Pulteney. It is, as far as I know, the only edition of the entire tablets. It has it in the original language and also in English. An awful lot of this book is linguistics discussing Umbrian. Probably not of great interest, probably not something that is easily comprehended by people. I know I sort of just sort of glanced through it and my eyes kind of glazed over. But the text is worth reading. It's a ritual manual. It says at this place in the town you do this ritual. It's sort of sketchy. It doesn't give all the details, but it gives more details than we usually find for ancient rituals. The second book on the same subject, Michael Weiss, Language and Ritual in Sabellic Italy. He took two of the tablets, I forget how many there are, and translates them or retranslates them, going through it word by word, section by section. So it's very, very detailed and an awful lot of heavy, deep, and real linguistics in here, which I skimmed a lot of. But he'll take a section of it, rip it apart piece by piece, and then at the end of the section he will give you his translation of all of that. So even if you're not understanding or interested in the little bits of pieces of why this word is this word, you'll have the full version there, and he disagrees with Pulteney in a number of cases. He's a very good scholar. He's at Cornell, I believe, very highly respected. This book itself is well respected. Even in the sections on the Umbrian language, you should still look through them because there are a lot of notes and there's just a lot of information in there on Roman religion. Like I said earlier, sometimes in order to understand the Umbrian, we have to know what the Romans did, and he includes that. He includes a lot of quotations from Servius and from Festus. Festus is another one of those amazing sources on Roman religion that hasn't been translated, and he gives it. Now sometimes he and other people give Servius and Festus in Latin and doesn't translate it for you. I would recommend setting up a computer file with quotations from Servius and Festus so that you'll have all the ones you run across in one easy place. Even if you can only find them in Latin, who knows, someday you might learn Latin, or you might find someone who is willing to translate them for you. It's just useful to have it all in one place. So those are the fairly introductory books on Roman religion that I'd like to recommend. Like I said, there's a lot of information out there. There are also journals. The major work of academics goes on in the journals. The books are actually always a few years out of date as far as the latest material is concerned. There's a journal of Roman religion, for instance, and frequently there's information in the archaeological journals. What you're going to need for those is to find a decent college library. There's really no other solution for it. The closest you can come to a solution is online. A lot of academics and even journals put their articles online. I've even found complete books there. The best way to do this is to go to Google and go to the advanced search. You can look up only articles that are in PDF form. Almost all academic articles online are going to be in PDF form, and most of the stuff that's just crap isn't going to be. So it gives you an advantage. You're still going to have to whack back some of the crap, but at least you're a bit ahead of the game. I found some truly amazing stuff there. In the description section, I'll give you a link to one particular article that's on the role of women in Roman ritual, particularly domestic ritual. It's quite interesting, and also including a lot of quotations from primary sources. So that's what I have here for today. If you've got any questions, just put them in the comment section or send me a PM. Other than that, happy researching. Thank you. Goodbye.